You know it's not a very scary animal? The prairie dog. Unless you're intimidated by their bark or concerned about getting the Black Plague, then in that case, they're a little bit scary. But otherwise, they're mostly just cute. I was curious if they ate meat, so I looked it up, and apparently sometimes they eat bugs, which isn't really meat, but it got me thinking, if they were larger, would they eat other types of animals as well? I had this 3D model for my Wild Imaginary West game, and it looks only slightly scarier than a normal prairie dog, until you see it next to a human in the same scale. Then it's a lot worse. Today I'm making a cross-section of a burrow of a prairie wolf, which is a supersized carnivorous ground squirrel from the Wild Imaginary West. And so as not to create any confusion about who this burrow belongs to, I included a prairie wolf in my drawing on the iPad. To begin the build, I grabbed a thick sheet of styrofoam. I will do some subtractive sculpting of this block to find the animal burrow that hides within. I roughly translated what I had drawn on the iPad onto the foam with a Sharpie, and then I broke out my hot wire table, which I will use to remove the top of the foam. After that, I switched to a handheld hot wire to make the burrow entrance a little rounder, followed by a plunge from another hot wire. This long, thin foam knife was not the right tool for what I was trying to do, so after a little bit of frustration, I switched over to my faithful rotary tool to do the rest of the carving. I was wearing a mask and had proper ventilation the whole time I was doing this. I started making a huge mess with those foam balls, so in order to limit that, I broke out a vise, which I repurposed as a vacuum holder for this situation. Which got me thinking I should probably just come up with a dedicated attachment for the vacuum to use in this way at some point in the future. With a marginal amount of dust collection, I proceeded to carve out the rest of the cavities. This method with the rotary tool worked beautifully. With that done, I can now suck up the rest of the foam beads that had escaped the vacuum the first time, and then put the vise and the vacuum away. To get rid of the beady texture on the foam, I used a torch to melt it to a more organic surface. It was important to do this slowly and carefully, or I could have set the whole foam block on fire irreparably. I've never been the best at coloring within the lines, so the torch escaped and got on the front, which I had to go back and smooth out with an orbital sander, which was on a higher speed than it should have been. Luckily, I didn't ruin anything and was able to get it back to a nice, smooth surface with no issues. Next, it was time to add some texture, and for that, I needed to switch back to an older hobby mat. I broke out a Chipotle mixing tray, and just then, I got a package in the mail. I was looking forward to this package because I got to order one of Gamey Build's limited edition hardcover copies of his new book, The Children of Aegis, which is a story set in the universe that he created using dioramas on YouTube. I know years of love and creativity went into producing this, so if you want the opportunity to support another YouTuber like me, go check out Gamey Builds and his book in the description. The next step in the building process was to mix up a small amount of Sculptamold. I will use this to clean up and form the entrance of the burrow. I've been using a little less water than recommended these days for my Sculptamold, which helps it dry faster, but also gives it a much shorter working time. For the rest of the foam, I'm going to be surfacing it with a terrain paste made from plaster, paint, and Mod Podge, with a generous amount of flocking sprinkled in as well to give it a little bit of a dirt texture. I made sure to keep it nice and thin using water so that I could brush it on rather than using something like a palette knife. I added the paste to the top of the diorama, and then I decided to go ahead and cover the whole thing while I was at it. Typically I would go with a smooth surface, painted black around the outside, but this time around I wanted to try something a little different. While we wait for the burrow to dry, it's time to paint some minis, and while I do that, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. I decided to swap out the doctor miniature that I showed at the very beginning of the video with the marshal, who's in a better pose considering the danger of the situation. After priming the miniatures black with the airbrush, I began building up the colors, starting with a deep red, which other than the black in the deepest recesses will be my darkest shadow color. After that, I layered on the rest of the colors, getting lighter and lighter as I went. The wildlife of the Wild Imaginary West is made up of a variety of creatures, many of which, including this one, are inspired by real wildlife of North America. There are, of course, also cryptids and mythological creatures included, but I personally love the larger, scarier versions of wildlife that I see fairly often. In fact, I see prairie dogs almost every day. So when I visited the zoo in Korea last year and I saw an exhibit dedicated to prairie dogs, I laughed. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and I realized that at every zoo in the whole world, there are plenty of animals that are commonplace somewhere else. There's a Bactrian camel at the Denver Zoo, for instance, which is a fairly regular animal to see in Mongolia. So after thinking about it, I realized that the novelty of most animals is simply a matter of exposure, which I forgot to adjust on my camera after moving my desk lamp, which is why some of the highlights look a little bit blown out, and you may not be able to see them as well as I could when I was painting these. After the PDO-US, it was time to paint the details on the Marshal. A little story that I made up in my head for this scenario is that someone in town reported their livestock had been disappearing, so they called the Marshal, and they asked him to look into it. Forestalls, which in universe repel monsters, can't penetrate the ground, which means that effectively a prairie wolf could burrow its way into an otherwise safe area and remain mostly unbothered. Now, it does have to come up to grab prey, and when it did, it would have to fight its way through a bummer of a headache, but a nice plump cow would definitely be worth it. With the minis done, it was time to paint the base, which was now nice and dry. But before adding the paint, I decided to spruce things up with some dead animal bits from Wargames Atlantic. They have some nice boxes of bits like this. I picked out what would reasonably be assumed to occupy a prairie wolf discard pile, with some unidentified rib cages, bones, and antlers. To decorate the rest of the burrow, I used this creeping vine from Diorama Prosepe, which looks a lot like roots. Come to think of it, it's probably because it is roots. Either way, I snipped it up to make nesting material for one of the chambers, and then I embedded a few single strands for some exposed subterranean roots. After that, I gave the walls a coat of Vallejo splash mud texture, and then I turned my attention to the surface. Assuming prairie wolves eat mostly meat and not grass, there would be quite a bit of undisturbed grass around the burrow. So I threw on some static tack and static grass, and then I shook off the excess. When all the more recently added wet stuff was finally dry, I began priming certain elements black and then moved on to painting the rest. After I finished this diorama, I realized there's not much wild or imaginary about it if you take away the human element. Without the addition of the Marshal at the end, this would be a perfectly fine diorama for a school research project based on studying the life and habitat of ground squirrels in North America. But that's cool. The Wild Imaginary West is supposed to feel 80% normal with 20% sprinkle of fun. Like I mentioned earlier, I decided not to paint the sides black, but rather lean into the texture and make it appear like earth. I used a sponge to create a gradient, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. One thing I wasn't completely happy with, though, was the color of the tunnels. So I threw in some pigment powder, blew out the excess, and sealed it with isopropyl alcohol. When that was dry, the last thing to do was to touch up the bones and make them pop a little better. I did that by painting on some bone white, followed by some skeleton horde, to make them look a little bit more fresh. I had to remove a little bit of the rim to make room for the rodent before I could glue it in place. I got that out of the way with an X-Acto knife, and then once the characters had been glued in place, I followed that with a touch-up of paint. And after that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.